Okay, so we have to talk about Assassin's Creed. Way back in 2007, we got the first Assassin's Creed game. And on the one hand, as much as I know that I've already talked quite a bit about it on the lectures, we are in a new format here. We're starting from scratch. Let's just run through from the beginning. Back in 2007, we had our first Assassin's Creed game. It was supposed to be a Prince of Persia game. It wasn't a Prince of Persia game. It was a whole new thing. And it was pretty good. I had a lot of nice things to say about it in my lecture on the subject. Feel free to go track that down. Basically, I was excited about this game as a proof of concept. That Assassin's Creed seemed like this series with a whole lot of potential. That here we were, bopping through time, conducting assassinations, engaging with our setting, trying to represent it in a historically accurate way. There were some major gameplay problems. A lot of people were frustrated with all of those repetitive quests and, walking up and down the mountain all the time. And the story structure was a little weird. But overall, I thought it was a cool idea. I was excited for more. In Assassin's Creed 2, which released 2 years later in 2009, I found that the gameplay problems had in fact been corrected, but when we corrected the gameplay problems, we also imported a whole lot of Dan Brown conspiracy theory nonsense, which made no sense and really was frustrating. In a lot of ways, Assassin's Creed 2 is the proper successor to the original game. It updated the gameplay, there were a lot of really cool elements. It was slick looking, played nicely, and was a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, this was not actually what I was on board for. As much fun as it is to bop around Venice and to hang out with various cool people in the Renaissance, I wanted a deeper engagement with the philosophical themes that the first game had brought up. This whole freedom versus order dilemma that promised to be explored throughout time. And in Assassin's Creed 2, we had boiled it down to a pretty simple, straightforward binary. Assassins are good, Templars are bad, don't ask questions. And this did not necessarily get fixed anytime soon either. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood was basically just a cheap cash-in, little more than an overblown expansion sold for full price at the time. There was no theme. There wasn't even a terribly cogent story or plot. There were tons of modes and tons of distractions and tons of things to do in this game, but none of them seemed to connect to one another thematically or even in a plot sense. It was all the Assassin's Creed trappings without any of the Assassin's Creed substance, and I was really frustrated by it. It was fun in its way. There was some really weird stuff with that conspiracy nonsense, which somebody should really check in on whoever that person was and make sure that they weren't thrown into a dungeon in Ubisoft headquarters. But nonetheless, it was overwhelmingly a pretty disappointing game. Revelations, on the other hand, was actually a high watermark, in my opinion. It was pretty solidly designed. Again, the gameplay was updated, slicker and smoother than ever before. The bombs mechanic was a really nice touch that added a lot of strategy and a lot of style to the way that you played the game. It had a really interesting plot, even if it wasn't fully explored or developed, as you sort of followed Suleiman and his rise to power, and the dilemma of the history did not exactly line up with our Templar versus Assassin binary that we had been exploring. It was a cool game. It was worthwhile. I enjoyed playing it. I thought it was pretty cool. Certainly better than Brotherhood, even if we were trying way too hard to make that Desmond plot mean anything, especially leading up to Assassin's Creed 3. Assassin's Creed 3 itself was supposedly the big reboot the franchise was looking for. After the two sort of quasi-sequels, everybody was kind of sick of this franchise, didn't want any more repetitive nonsense, so we got a ground-up whole redux, new engine, new characters, new time period, new everything. And there was hype to burn on this one, but it was kind of a mess when actually delivered. There were a lot of cool decisions about Assassin's Creed 3. The opening fake-out where you're playing as the Templars for a while was really neat. The the robust explanation of the political situation at the time, where the colonists and the loyalists aren't necessarily allies to the Native Americans or to the assassins, and the assassin-Templar divide seems to be crossing the colonist-loyalist divide. There was a lot of redirection to that same moral ambiguity and exploration of that freedom and order theme that I've been so excited about, but it wasn't consistently done, and it very much seemed like this was a game that was developed by a whole bunch of teams locked in separate boxes, unable to talk to each other, and as far as my research has suggested, that is exactly what happened. Then we get Assassin's Creed 4, which is very much the apotheosis of the game in a lot of ways. Although it is much more focused on the naval combat and way downplays all of the assassin missions that we've seen as a major part of this game to date, that admittedly have been kind of growing less and less a part of the franchise as successive games have gone on. Assassin's Creed 4 was awesome to play. It was thematic to the roots, exploring this pirate utopia idea in the context of the Assassins versus Templars, freedom versus order divide. It was neat, it was fun, it was cool. I have nothing but nice things to say about it. Highly recommend it, and yeah, we had a lot of fun with it. That brings us basically up to where I got in my recorded lectures, and again, I highly recommend that you go check them out if you want a deeper read on any of these games. But the fact of the matter is, after Assassin's Creed 4, things get messy for Ubisoft. And part of the reason why I want to do a whole recap and reboot is because we also need to look at the corporate underbelly of what's been going on here. Most of the lectures that I've delivered so far have focused instead on the marketing angle, the how are we going to sell this game, the way that it was popularly received as well as critically received, and a sort of deep dive into the themes and exploring the gameplay and what it means, all that sort of stuff. Today, though, again, since this is the first big video, and this is our first Assassin's Creed replay thing on Video Game Academy's YouTube page, I want to instead focus on the corporate angle, what has been going on and how these games get made. Because it doesn't take a whole lot of exploration beyond Black Flag to realize that more often than not, these games are kind of a mess. Today we're going to be focusing on the sequels, the expansions, the weird entries in the franchise, the ones that were not the mainline releases, numbered, emphasizing that there was an entire reboot to the franchise. Today we're looking at the weird stuff. Between Assassin's Creed 3's release in 2012 and Assassin's Creed 5 Unity's release in 2014, we got a lot of stuff happening. The 3 games that I have been playing over the last 3 months, trying desperately to record and slogging through because none of them were especially fun, especially after, following up with Black Flag. In that time, we saw Assassin's Creed Liberation, released simultaneously on PS Vita at the same time as Assassin's Creed 3 released, like literally the same day. We saw the standalone expansion to Assassin's Creed Black Flag, Freedom Cry, and we also get Assassin's Creed Rogue, which was weirdly released on the same day as Assassin's Creed Unity, largely because Unity was being released for the new next-gen consoles, PS4 and Xbox One, if I'm not mistaken, where Rogue was on the older consoles, PS3 and Xbox 360, which up until then had been like the mainstays. Since these were brand new consoles, Ubisoft didn't feel quite comfortable like banking the entire franchise on only the people who had bought the newest hotness, and so we get both of these games. But I want to stress, again, in 2 years, all of these games came out. Assassin's Creed saw 5 new entries in 2 years, 6 if we count Unity itself, which we should, because Unity was famously broken, and you kind of have to wonder if this is not why. But I also want to track this whole Assassin's Creed process against the bigger corporate objectives of Ubisoft during this time period and everything else that is going on. Because the fact of the matter is, Ubisoft has been playing this game for a while now. Back in 2007, when Assassin's Creed first came out, Ubisoft had one big flagship franchise. Specifically, they had Prince of Persia. That was the game that everybody was excited about. That was the game that was trying to be pushed out the door on a fairly yearly release schedule, but at the time in 2007, there hadn't been a Prince of Persia game in a little while. The Two Thrones had come out, and nobody really seemed to care that much about it. There was, in fact, plans for this new fancy Prince of Persia game coming out a couple of years later, but that wasn't happening yet. And again, in theory, this was going to be another Prince of Persia game, another big entry from the big flagship franchise, when all of a sudden it was decided this is not that. In fact, we're going to launch this new franchise. Now, we got to talk about Ubisoft's corporate structure here for a moment. Like most major game companies now, Ubisoft was located at a whole bunch of different locations across the globe. Ubisoft is actually one of the most multinational game corporations and was sort of doing that earlier than a lot of their competitors. So back in 2007, the main team that was working on Assassin's Creed was Ubisoft Montreal. And Montreal has, in general, been the headquarters of the Assassin's Creed franchise. The first game's creative director was a guy by the name of Patrice Désilets. He's important. We should remember this person. The first game was also written by Corey May, who will also be kind of pivotal to the first few games. It took a while to develop, though. Assassin's Creed was in progress for like 4 years between 2004 and 2007 before it finally got shipped out the door. And remember, it came under some pretty heavy critical scrutiny and for the most part was kind of like, yeah, this is a really good idea, but its execution is pretty bad. So immediately Assassin's Creed 2 went into the works. From 2007 to 2009, that was, again, Ubisoft Montreal's major project here. Patrice Désilets remained the creative director. Corey May remained the head name on the writing staff. Not a whole lot had changed, but a whole lot more resources were devoted to the work. And importantly, 3/4 of the way through the project, Ubisoft sort of instructed Ubisoft Singapore to help out with the project as it was working in Ubisoft Montreal. Now again, for a corporation that has many different departments, many different programming teams across the globe, and Ubisoft did at this point, or at least they were starting to expand their projects at this point, this is a fairly natural thing to do. But I should stress, back in 2009, this was not normal. This is not the way that you typically do game design, or at least it doesn't seem to be based on the research that I'm doing. And it seems that Désilets agreed. Because Désilets was frustrated by the fact that Singapore got involved, or at least that's how I read the situation. By the end of Assassin's Creed 2's development, he seems to be pretty frustrated with the way that Ubisoft is handling the situation. I imagine he's a little grumpy about Singapore muscling in on his territory. I suspect that Assassin's Creed 2 wasn't the game he was planning to ship. Now, deep in my heart of hearts, I am hoping that Assassin's Creed, or that Ubisoft Singapore's contribution was all that conspiracy nonsense that I hated, and that Désilets' vision was the same as mine, but I have no evidence that is the case. That is pure headcanon. What I do know, though, is that by the time that Assassin's Creed 2 shipped, and already everyone was instructed it's time to get on board for Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, which took a mere year to develop, Désilets had it and he left. Corey May was still on staff as one of the major writers, and Désilets is also on the writing staff, or at least credited on the writing staff for Brotherhood. But it is clear that that sort of monolithic guidance and direction that Désilets was offering him as the head of the Assassin's Creed project was over. And what I want to stress is that this is never going to be the same again. For all future Assassin's Creed sequels after Brotherhood, Ubisoft adopts a policy where it's going to be Montreal that is heading the project in most cases, but as we get closer and closer to ship date, more and more teams from across the world are going to stick their fingers into the Assassin's Creed pot. The ultimate end result is going to be the product of largely Montreal's guidance, but with many other teams pitching in as the deadline draws closer and closer, which again is going to get real significant. Again, Brotherhood is kind of a mess, and I am, it's fun enough. The gameplay is definitely there, but it was clearly rushed, clearly shipped out the door with not a whole lot of, effort to try and turn it into one thematic whole. And once again, Ubisoft Singapore was brought in on the project and almost certainly was on it much more consistently than they were for Assassin's Creed 2. So it seems that this is much more cooperative and also much less single-minded and directed than Assassin's Creed 2 was, which very much explains its sort of confusion. But Assassin's Creed Revelations, which again I had nice things to say about, is actually the product of way more teams. Where Brotherhood took only a year to develop between 2009 and 2010, again, rushed out the door in a very real sense. Revelations was also very much rushed out the door between 2010 and 2011, but no fewer than 6 teams are credited for working on this project, namely Ubisoft Montreal again as the head team, but also NC, Ubisoft Massive, Ubisoft Quebec, Singapore is back, and Ubisoft Bucharest to boot. Now, this is what I want to stress. Up until this point, when Ubisoft releases a new game, it's typically coming from one of these teams, one of these studios across the world, and has been worked by that studio until it is released. Ubisoft, up until this point, had their 1 or 2 major flagship franchises, Prince of Persia, now Assassin's Creed, and at this point they're starting to talk about Far Cry 3 in 2012. They're gradually becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger producer of video games. But the fact is, Ubisoft was making a lot of games before this. It's just that they weren't big flagship AAA titles. They were excellent at making that sort of shovelware stuff that in the 2000s nobody was terribly excited about, but everybody knew that it existed and was actually a huge seller. And I actually remember watching E3 back in 2011 or 2012, some of the major executives at Ubisoft very much stressing this was the place where they were making the most money, making games up for Nintendo DS for teens or for tweens for that matter, like Bratz spin-offs or licensed games like that. That was very much the moneymaker for them. Having a big flagship franchise was kind of new to Ubisoft at this particular point in time. Yes, they had made waves with the Prince of Persia franchise. Yes, they had other franchises that they had done similarly well with. But the fact of the matter is, having a big budget franchise like Assassin's Creed that was consistently paying the bills and that was also, expected to have a big time yearly release was kind of a new deal for them. And as a consequence, more and more teams got involved with this particular game, leaving beside whatever projects that they were working on at the time. And increasingly, this is the model that Ubisoft is going to practice. So for Assassin's Creed Revelations, we get 6 Ubisoft teams across the world working on it. And again, as much as this game seems to have a whole lot more direction than Brotherhood did, it's clear that a lot of the components and a lot of the features especially kind of exist in separate boxes and in separate sort of categories. Like I stressed at the time, one of the big selling points of Assassin's Creed Revelations was this fancy new tower defense mode, where the Templars would raid your hideout and you'd have to defend it, and it was this whole thing, and it was kind of really bad and not terribly well implemented, and you only have to do it once in the entire game, and then you can ignore it forevermore if that is your prerogative. The game makes it very easy to ignore. It's kind of hard not to see that as, some random other team's incorporation, something that was handed down from on high, fulfilled by, Ubisoft Bucharest, and then plugged into the game as a sort of superficial extra feature to advertise on the back of the box. And this is something that I suspect is going to plague future Assassin's Creed games down the line, especially Assassin's Creed 3. Assassin's Creed 3 was famously a product of this sort of team mentality, this cooperation without actual cooperation. Like Revelations, we had a pile of participants in the development of Assassin's Creed 3. All of the teams that worked on Assassin's Creed Revelations are back to put together Assassin's Creed 3, with the exception of Ubisoft Massive. I could find no evidence that was the case. But Montreal, Singapore, Quebec, NC, and Bucharest are all back, all putting their touches on it. But what I want to stress is that Assassin's Creed 3 in 2012 was released at exactly the same day as Assassin's Creed Liberation in 2012, which was the collaborative product concept of Ubisoft Sofia and Milan. And as much as this was a big first-party AAA title from the same people who brought us Assassin's Creed 2 and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Assassin's Creed Revelation, we should stress that at the same time as this was going on, Far Cry 3 had come out and a wide variety of other pretty top-notch AAA games from Ubisoft. This is where Ubisoft is putting too many irons in the fire at any given moment, and it shows here. There's also a lot of corporate and industry scuttlebutt about Assassin's Creed 3 being very rushed, being very much the product of a whole lot of different design sensibilities, and stitched together at the end with very little care for the end result. Many rumors exist from people who are supposedly like anonymous sources working on Assassin's Creed 3 that the whole thing is a giant pile. And it shows. Again, there are some really good ideas in Assassin's Creed 3, probably things that had been well developed and well put together long before the game shipped, because people were in fact working on it since 2009. Like, Assassin's Creed 3 had been green-lit as soon as Assassin's Creed 2 had been a success. Which means while Brotherhood was being released, while Revelation was being worked on, Assassin's Creed 3 was still in production. So chances are some of its best ideas had been there from the beginning. And some of our main players in Ubisoft's, bullpen were definitely major players on the project. I can't help but think that Corey May, the writer who was from Assassin's Creed 1 and worked on Assassin's Creed 2 as well, I can't help but think that he was a pivotal writer for Assassin's Creed 3 as well. Chances are he brought a lot of the good ideas that he had for 1 and 2 to 3 as well, and his sort of guidance is probably what kept it as consistent as it turned out to be. But nonetheless, it is still kind of a mess, and it is clearly the product of a whole lot of design sensibilities, probably quite a few corporate notes and various committees bumping heads at various times. But I also think that one of the major problems here is that, again, while this was going on, it was also a priority in another studio elsewhere that Liberation had to be out the door at the exact same time. It's also worth noting that both of them have crossover elements. Assassin's Creed 3 makes reference to Aveline in Liberation, and at the end of Assassin's Creed Liberation, Aveline literally meets Connor and runs around in New York. So as much as, Assassin's Creed 3 is supposedly not the product of Ubisoft Sofia and Milan, you can't help but think that, they're ultimately borrowing and exchanging assets. They're all essentially working on both games to some degree. If they're not comparing design notes, we wouldn't have this much consistency, this much crossover between these two games. And again, we should stress, Far Cry 3 came out the exact same year, was another huge flagship title for Ubisoft, and was run through many of the same studios, many of the same departments. Increasingly, rather than seeing one team working on one game start to finish, we are seeing one team starts a project several years in advance of its release, and then the closer we get to that release, more and more teams get sidelined from whatever else they're working on to dogpile on this one project, get it shipped, get it out the door, no matter what state it's in order to make their deadlines and, keep the investors and consumers happy. Now, in 2013, we get Black Flag. And Black Flag, again, is amazing. As much as I would love to say at this point, oh, yes, it was the product of just Ubisoft Montreal, or, it clearly had fewer teams working on it, that's definitely not true. Assassin's Creed 4 was definitely the product of more teams than Ubisoft had ever committed to a game to this point. Montreal was once again at the lead, but Annecy, Bucharest, Kiev, Milan, Montpellier, Quebec, and Singapore, and Sofia all got in on Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. All of them were credited, all of them are recognized as contributing in some way. And while there's no way for you to sort of track who did what, certainly not from, my chair where I'm just doing cursory Google searches on the internet, it is clear that the theory that any committee-made game is doomed to fail is a bad theory, because this one was clearly committee-made and worked somehow. I suspect at this point we have better resources for doing this. That now that Ubisoft has been doing this for a few years, they're practiced, they understand, like, how can you have one director sort of leading all of this charge. But even if we were to say, it's because this one was in development for a while, it really wasn't. Black Flag was started development in 2011, so right after Assassin's Creed Revelations, and it was clearly in development at the same time as Assassin's Creed 3 was in development, but, it's not clear exactly which one was the priority at any given moment. There's a decent chance that, at some point, they didn't know which one they were going to ship at which time. At any rate, it was a shorter development time with more studios working on it, and it worked way better, in my opinion, than Assassin's Creed 3. The difference, though, is that it did not get the double release. And as much as 2012 was a huge, busy year for Ubisoft, releasing Far Cry 3, Assassin's Creed 3, Assassin's Creed Liberation, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag and Freedom Cry, its little standalone expansion, were the only games Ubisoft released in its AAA tier. There were no other Far Cries, there were no other Prince of Persias, to my knowledge. Watch Dogs had yet to be developed. It was clearly in development, but it hadn't actually come out. So more time, more concentration was likely spent on this one game, especially getting closer to its release date, than we saw with Assassin's Creed 3 or Liberation for that matter. So I suspect that's the key here. If Ubisoft devotes the resources and effort to getting this thing done at the right time and not letting anything else distract or get in the way, you can turn out a really good game. But if you don't, then things get messy. And that brings us to 2014. What I want to stress here, because I know it's going to come up in the next discussion, I know it's going to come up in the next rant, Assassin's Creed Unity is a friggin' mess. It is one of the most famously broken games Ubisoft has ever released. It was a huge embarrassment at the time. It likely derailed the entire Assassin's Creed franchise. Yes, I do want to talk about that in its own time, but we need to anticipate in order to talk about exactly what is going on at the Ubisoft, corporate headquarters right now. We need to recognize that 2014 went horribly, horribly wrong for Ubisoft in a variety of ways. And it's pretty obvious to see why when you look at what their slate of games for that year was. Again, 2012 was super busy. We got Assassin's Creed Liberation, we got Assassin's Creed 3, we got Far Cry 3. 2014 makes 2012 look boring. Early in 2014, Ubisoft released Watch Dogs, a project they'd been working on for a long time, once again helmed by Ubisoft Montreal. In 2014, a little bit later, in November, Far Cry 4 was released, which is, by many people's reckoning, from what I understand, one of the better games in the franchise, so it clearly got the attention it deserved, which is good. But once again, Ubisoft Montreal, one of the Ubisoft Montreal teams, because at this point there's 3 different Ubisoft Montreal teams, helmed the project along with Toronto, Shanghai, and Kiev, because at this point Ubisoft has exploded in size and has offices all over the freaking world. And for that matter, in November 2014, the same month that Far Cry 4 releases, we get Assassin's Creed Rogue for the older generation consoles and Assassin's Creed Unity released the same day. So why is Assassin's Creed Unity broken? Because Ubisoft broke their rule. Because way too many teams were focusing on all of these games. None of them got a chance to concentrate on any one of them. It was not in any one team's hands for long enough to be backed up. And for that matter, Ubisoft's whole schedule had been so packed this year that there was no chance that it would get the resources it deserved. So it released broken. It released half-finished with all of these bugs and all of this mess, and you can, to this day, see reviewers just paddling the crap out of it for being basically a barely done mess. Even though I do think that there will be some redeeming qualities once we actually get around to talking about it. But this is what I want to stress about the Ubisoft corporate structure. Increasingly, we are seeing Ubisoft move towards releasing these games without any interest in their integrity and in the integrity of the design and development process. These are corporate made from a variety of different committees, all working together in some loose sense because they're literally in different parts of the world and there's only so much that you can do to communicate with each of these teams. Each of them are responsible for completing some element of this game that they are, in fact, releasing. And as Ubisoft gets bigger and bigger, they are releasing more and more AAA games with more and more development resources from all of these different teams being moved around and dedicated, like, at the drop of a hat to whatever needs to be the top priority at this particular moment. Even if this particular moment is within 2 or 3 weeks, as was undoubtedly the case with Far Cry 4, Rogue, and Unity. We are talking about a giant mess here. And I want to look at these 3 games, these sort of not major Assassin's Creed titles, to look at the ways that they do in fact fall down, because they do pretty consistently fall down. In 2022, as I was recording all of my lectures for the various Assassin's Creed games and getting excited about each one of them in turn, like, I played all of the first 6 Assassin's Creed games in about 5 or 6 months. I played through Assassin's Creed 1 over the summer of 2022. I played Assassin's Creed 2 in something like 3 weeks in September. By the time that, like, November rolled around, I had already finished both Brotherhood and Revelations. And was working my way onto Assassin's Creed 3, and then by the last day of the year, I had not only finished Assassin's Creed 4, but shipped my lecture. It took me 3 months, half that time, to get through these 3 little games. And part of that might just be my disposition. Like, a lot kind of changed for me in those 3 months. My schedule got very different. I was, busy getting distracted by, like, looking for a housing situation. But the fact of the matter is, either because of all of these factors, or because I moved onto the computer rather than playing in the living room on my PS3, or because I was in fact recording video footage of all of this stuff in order to present this nice video that you're probably looking at this particular moment in time, whatever the case may be, I enjoyed these games a lot less than I enjoyed the first 6 games in the franchise, and I've been playing them at a snail's pace as a consequence. And that's largely because, as much as these are fine games, they're not good games. They are fun by turns, but they do not have the same sort of thematic unity of the games that we've seen before, even the ones that don't successfully achieve thematic unity, like Assassin's Creed 3 or Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. I also played them in reverse order, so I apologize if I've got my facts wrong on some of the later ones, especially like Assassin's Creed Rogue, because it's been a while since I played through that one. But let's break them down one by one. Assassin's Creed Liberation, like I said, is released on the exact same day as Assassin's Creed 3. It was a parallel release for PlayStation Vita. It was never meant to be a huge game, but because of the way that, like, remasters and stuff work today, you can now get Liberation online on a variety of platforms. Like, at the end of the day, though, it's kind of weird. We haven't talked a whole lot about the way that Assassin's Creed has been sold. Like, the fact that most of these games since Assassin's Creed 3 have been released in, like, these fancy editions where it's like you can get the basic edition for $60, or the gold edition, or the platinum edition, or the piracy edition, or whatever. And they all come with different tiers, and they all come with different advantages, like the season pass, or the expansion content, or maybe fancy doodads that ship with the package, who knows. But Assassin's Creed Liberation, trying to play it now is kind of rough. Like, you can, in fact, download the standalone game on Steam for, like, $15, which is kind of a high buy-in for a game that's that old and that small. I ended up getting it on Epic as part of the Assassin's Creed 3 remaster that came out, like, a couple years ago, because it was actually cheaper in the long run, and yet Liberation is very much the tacked-on expansion that you have to, like, go through the back door of the game in order to actually access, so there's that to consider. The reason why I wanted to play Liberation, because I was originally thinking of just dismissing it. Like, it was for Vita, I don't need to care. The reason why I went back is actually because of a video that Chris Franklin did over at Errant Signal, which, you should be watching him if you are not already. He basically did a video where he looked at all 3 of the games that came out in that year, specifically Liberation, and Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, and Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, and looked at the way that their various mechanics communicated information to the player about the world and the characters that they inhabited. Which is especially relevant for Liberation and Freedom Cry, because in both of these games you play as black people, in a society that is very suspicious of black people, especially if they have been in some way supposedly liberated. Aveline is an especially interesting case for this sort of discussion, because the sort of primary new mechanic that Assassin's Creed Liberation introduces is that Aveline has 3 outfits, and each of those outfits radically changes the way that you interact with the world. So when Aveline is dressed up in her assassin outfit, like the fancy, like very practical boot and hat and like the sleeves that dispel the blades and everything, she is automatically suspicious. Like, guards are already a little bit alert to her presence, you already attract unnecessary attention, presumably because you are a black woman in assassin's outfits. Something that you don't have happen when you are playing as Edward Kenway in Assassin's Creed 4. You are welcome to just climb buildings and nobody pays any attention to you unless you happen to be someplace you aren't supposed to be. Aveline is immediately suspicious wearing the garb of the assassin. And as a consequence, you can change out of it. You can switch to the slave outfit, which allows you to blend much more successfully into your environment, but is also subject to getting heat more quickly than most of the other personas. If someone sees a slave acting out of the normal behavior, they are quicker to attack that slave, quicker to suspect that slave, and therefore you have to always blend in order to successfully navigate through areas that are being watched or monitored by guards. You have the advantage of you can pick up boxes. If you are a slave doing work, people just completely ignore you, apparently, which does in fact track. But other than that, like, you gotta watch yourself and maybe avoid climbing buildings, because if someone sees a slave climbing a building, they're going to get immediately suspicious. Finally, you can also dress up as a lady. Aveline is a freeborn citizen of New Orleans, adopted by her rich father and stepmother, and both of them confer a certain amount of nobility on her, which was fairly typical in New Orleans at the time. Like, there is a very complicated relationship in New Orleans between the black slaves, the freeborn blacks, the blacks who had in fact been liberated by their masters or indeed were adopted. Like, the French society in New Orleans in the 18th century was way more open to adopting your black daughter or son than the colonies that were founded by England at the time. So there is definitely some historical background to what's happening here, for sure. Aveline as a lady is the most difficult to spot. She is the one who fits most neatly into the crowd. People do see her and pay attention to her, but you are also limited in your actions. You can't climb buildings while you're wearing the big fancy dress. The most that you do is you get an umbrella, which also serves as apparently a dart gun, which is very convenient and can be used without anybody detecting what you were up to, which is very convenient and handy if you do in fact need to assassinate somebody for some reason as Aveline in lady mode. But importantly, she can't climb buildings, she can't navigate around obstacles, she has to go through them. And she usually can't. Like, you can bribe guards to get out of the way because everyone expects her to have money and everyone lets rich people do whatever they want. You can get, random people on the side of the road to, accompany you. Like, you can basically seduce various men who are located around New Orleans, and they'll, walk next to you, and you can blend more effectively when you're with one of these companions, presumably because everybody expects that you're off to do something illicit. All of this behavior means she can move around in society largely unnoticed and doesn't even get, recognition. But again, like the slave, when she does in fact break the rules, she gets recognized almost immediately, and this reflects badly on her. It's also noteworthy to say that there are certain, muggers hanging around the city who react to each of the 3 personalities in different ways. If you're in Assassin's mode, they'll leave you alone. They know that you are not to be messed with. If you're in slave mode, they might very well harass you and possibly even threaten to rape you. If you are in Aveline Lady mode, they will mug you and try and take your money. Meaning, once again, depending on the way that Aveline is dressed, the way that she presents herself to the rest of the world, changes the way that the world reacts to you. And as the player, you have to think carefully and strategically about the way that she looks and the way that she will be received in order to get past certain obstacles. Which is interesting. It's a really cool idea. It's something that the Assassin's Creed franchise has sort of been hovering around for a long time, but hasn't really explored in any great detail until this moment. Usually, the whole business of the Assassin's Creed franchise, as far as, like the city and the crowds are a major mechanic that have always been pivotal to the franchise, your entire relationship to them basically involves the two states of being undetected or detected. Like, you don't want to be detected by guards, and there are those intermediary states where it's like they're suspicious of you, or you're in an area you're not supposed to be, but it is as binary as it gets. You are either anonymous and nobody is paying attention to you as long as you aren't doing anything suspicious, or you have been detected and everyone is mad at you and they're all coming for you. With Aveline, you have way more complicated shades of meaning, way more nuance to these relationships, and way more ways to interact with the world because people expect radically different things from her depending on the way that she's dressed and depending on the way that she's carrying herself. Which, again, makes a lot of sense. The primary writer of Assassin's Creed Liberation was a woman by the name of Jill Murray, or at least she was very much on the team and very much sort of credited with being one of the head writers of this project, who comes back for Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, and I suspect that a lot of the same motivation is kind of like underlying these two games. So we're going to sort of point to her as being the engineer behind these sorts of mechanics, even if that isn't quite appropriate. Largely because, again, these large corporate-made games have so many moving pieces and so many contributors that it is really hard to sort of attribute any one idea to any single person. But Murray is perhaps the one who gets the credit where these discussions tend to happen. It seems that Murray is attentive to these ideas in a way that the Assassin's Creed franchise hasn't up until this point. And in some ways, Liberation operates as a kind of experiment. In the same way that the first Assassin's Creed game operates as this grand experiment, like, here is my proof of concept, let's make a game about stealth where you assassinate people in various exotic historical periods and places. Murray seems to be doing something similar here. She is emphasizing that relationship between the player, the avatar, and the world in a way that even Assassin's Creed hasn't really explored all that deeply. And she is drawing attention to a character who is black and female, something that has been completely unprecedented in the franchise so far, and that too deserves praise. This is a fascinating outing on the part of Murray and company. This is a really different take on the Assassin's Creed franchise. Which is why it's such a shame that the game kind of stinks. Don't get me wrong, again, the central mechanic is fascinating, interacting with it is pretty well implemented, there's a lot of good stuff to talk about here. But the story is nonsense, start to finish. Yes, Aveline's situation as being the daughter of, a wealthy landowner and slave owner and sort of like working to liberate slaves while also using the benefits of her position to help her, that is a great setup. But it is not terribly well implemented because, again, this is a two-team project that was very much the also-ran to Assassin's Creed 3 and probably didn't get the attention or the development time that it deserved. Again, this was developed only between 2011 and 2012. It was probably rushed out the door as a companion piece to Assassin's Creed 3, which kind of stinks. Story-wise, it's a mess. The basic central plot here is that Aveline is, apparently working for the Assassins, though nobody talks about the Assassins or the Templars. It's this whole thing where it's apparently this has been a game produced by Abstergo for consumption, so, nobody refers out in an outspoken way to either one until, you've found Erudito, the mysterious glitch in the machine, who, reveals the actual underlying meaning of all of the scenes that you're watching. It's a weirdly implemented mechanic, and I didn't even see what they were doing with it for a while. I just thought they were, showing me the same stupid cutscenes over and over again, which at least that, is part of my impatience. But at the same time, like, the whole game revolves around, like, Aveline going to New Orleans and hanging around the town, which is probably the best executed of the places, and then going to the Bayou, which seems like a sort of, parallel to the frontier in Assassin's Creed 3. It's this big, wild, open, like, swampy area, as you would expect in New Orleans. Like, as far as the design is concerned, it's totally on point for what New Orleans Delta looks like. But at the same time, the Bayou is impossible to navigate. Like, it is a pain in the butt trying to climb up these trees or determine whether these routes can be stood upon, whereas these routes cannot. Like, it's really hard to pathfind in the Bayou, and as much as that might be token realism, it is still a very frustrating exercise as a player. Like, compared to the way that Assassin's Creed 3's traversal of the frontier works and how, obvious the paths through the trees tend to be, the Bayou is clearly the product of way less time and polish, and it shows. There were multiple times that I just knew that there was an objective that I was trying to get to and could find no way to get there except through trial and error or through a long roundabout way, or like hopping into a boat and finding out the boat couldn't go through a certain area. Like, it was incredibly frustrating to navigate. Aveline operates in both places, New Orleans and the Bayou. Like, she's got her smuggler contacts out in the Bayou who are helping her to free slaves and helping her achieve her various assassination objectives. She is apparently chasing after the Templars, but, like, it changes who the Templar target is, sometimes without warning. It's not entirely clear what the relationship is between Aveline, the supposed assassin recruit, and Agate, her mentor, but also Macandal, who is, like, I guess a Templar, but kind of dressed like an assassin and seems to be presented as though he's like a rival assassin who's gone off the rails. Like, it was real tough to keep track of what any of the characters were doing, what their motivations were, why they were doing the things that they were doing, beyond just go to the point, do the thing, fulfill the objective, move on to the next quest. There are a couple other locations you interact with. Aveline eventually ends up at Chichen Itza, where apparently a slave colony has been kind of set up, where, they're digging for precursor treasures in the same way that, like, every one of these games is essentially about some MacGuffin somewhere. But again, the MacGuffin is introduced so late into the project, and it seems so ancillary until it's not. It's really, really difficult to keep track of the thread here, which makes it all that much more complicated and messy when the final end of the game involves this deep psychological examination of Aveline, and, like, she starts questioning her loyalties because it turns out that her stepmother was actually the Templar who's been manipulating her this whole time. So she goes back to Agate, only he, like, betrays her, and then she's like, well, you should join me, and he's like, I should join you, and then she's like, but you betrayed me, and he's like, I guess I'll kill myself, and I don't know what's going on. I have no idea what's happening. And then finally we get this big fake-out ending where it's like, oh no, Aveline is now a Templar, she has agreed to take her stepmother's role, and it's like, oh, fake-out, it's the credits, but it's not really the credits, and Dr. Warren Vidic is the producer. Oh, looks like you need Erudito, and now here's the truth, and Aveline fights her way out of a giant pile of Templars, and then nothing makes sense anymore, and I don't know what's going on. It's very poorly implemented on a lot of fronts. As much as this is a really interesting concept for an Assassin's Creed game, as much as I would love to see them explore these ideas more, it's not happening here. Like, this is way less palatable as a game than even Assassin's Creed the first was. And as a proof of concept, I suspect that Assassin's Creed 1 only got through on the strength of its story, its theming, and this sort of like breath of fresh air approach towards like open world gameplay that Ubisoft was offering on that one. Liberation was kind of not worth playing for most gamers who weren't interested in like the actual, thematic mechanics or the way that the dress mechanic was implemented, and therefore I imagine nobody remembers this game especially fondly. Like, it was rough to get through. It only took me 8.5 hours to beat the entire game, Admittedly, I did not go out of the way to sort of complete it. Most of these 3 games I did not bother to complete as deeply as I did Assassin's Creed 3 for any of the games that I've played up until this point. Like, literally, for Black Flag, the only reason I stopped was because there was literally a quest I couldn't do anymore because the internet connection was down, which I've got my own complaints about that. But nonetheless, like, this is a game that I finished at 80% rather than the 97% of Black Flag or the 95% of Assassin's Creed 3. I couldn't deal with just more climbing around the bayou looking for alligator eggs, or more wandering around New Orleans in the various outfits in order to get the collectibles you can only get with those outfits, or more, wandering around Chichen Itza. Like, it was a pain in the butt. This is a really interesting idea that I would love to see again in later Assassin's Creed games, but this game itself is not one I'm going to be returning to anytime soon. Which brings us to Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, the standalone sequel to Assassin's Creed 4. The pedigree on this one is much clearer. Once again, we have Jill Murray as one of our primary writers, but we're also working in the Assassin's Creed 4 engine instead of the sort of homegrown PS Vita engine that apparently Sophia and Milan put together in order to make Liberation work, which means we're on much stronger footing as far as the gameplay is concerned, and for the most part, Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry knows better than to mess with the formula. You are hanging around the various city locations, specifically Saint-Domingue. You have quite a few boat stuff to do where you're sailing around in Adewale's brand new ship. Most of the mechanics, the little side missions like taking down forts or, capturing prison ships, are basically copy-pasted from Assassin's Creed 4, though given a new coat of paint and some slightly new mechanics here and there. And they're even smart enough to largely do away with all the underwater swimming missions, which were probably the nadir of Assassin's Creed 4, if I was going to be totally honest. Reserving those missions for a couple of isolated cases and very much dressing them up more effectively, making them more pivotal to the story and therefore sort of justifying their existence. On its face, Freedom Cry is way better put together than Liberation. And I should stress, of the 3 games we're talking about today, Freedom Cry is by far the one that I enjoyed the most. Where Liberation is kind of a complete mess as far as its story and its gameplay and even the way that it's theming, with its total incoherence as far as the Assassins versus Templars divide. Freedom Cry is as straightforward and plain-spoken as it comes, and I kind of love it for that. Chris Franklin, in his Errant Signal video, very much criticized Freedom Cry because it treated these slaves as tokens and as, objectives to just be captured and collected, which, at the end of the day is extremely dehumanizing. And on some level, I totally see his point, and I totally agree with him. That is absolutely the case. You would think that you'd be able to implement this in a much more effective way. But at the same time, I enjoyed the crap out of playing this game. And I, from the word go, when they're like, okay, Adewale, here you are on Saint-Domingue, there are horrible slavers everywhere on this island, and it is your job to free as many slaves as possible, the righteous vindication of just walking into a group of slavers and just killing the crap out of them was cathartic. On a level that I have not experienced before on any of these Assassin's Creed games, largely because either you have this moral gray area that kind of leaves it an open question as to whether or not what you were doing is right, or alternatively, this sort of really superficial justification, so the Templars are bad and the guards are with the Templars, so it's okay to kill the guards. Most of the time, in most of the Assassin's Creed games I've played so far, I have opted for stealth over confrontation whenever possible. It is my skill that dictates me climbing carefully over the rooftops, avoiding the notice of the guards, or taking down a couple of strategic ones in order to get to the target, who I do feel vindicated about killing. But in this game, they're like, hey, there are a bunch of people who are keeping other people as slaves, and I'm like, oh crap, guess who's here to murder all of them? From the word go, as Adewale, I was, jumping into, slave lines and just killing all the slavers and setting everybody free, or I would, wander over to a plantation and systematically knock out every single guard, preferably using stealth, but not terribly upset if it broke out open into trouble, just because I felt that moral righteousness in a way that I have not in many of these other games. And on some level, that is superficial, and that is a power fantasy, and that is nonsense, and it is just stupid game design. And on some other level, I'm just like, I don't even care. Power fantasies in game design are not necessarily a bad thing. It is a complicated conversation that we probably should have at some point. Like, is it okay to empower the player to kill lots and lots of people? Like, I imagine it's very situational. Some games do in fact justify it better than other games. But here in Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, as much as, like, I am aware of the more complicated moral considerations in this situation. I am aware of the fact that, like, these people are serving a system and a culture that, you know, is more complicated than just an easy they're all bad people dismissal would suggest. I want to stress that as justifications for violence go, these people are enslaving these people is a pretty good one. Like, yes, there is moral complexity, and there are conversations to be had about, you know, Django Unchained or similar, you know, properties treating violence in this way, or sort of like belittling the violence or belittling the circumstances of these slaves. At the same time, I feel like as far as there are all of these video games about, like, hey, kill all of these people with guns because we said so, killing them because they're slavers is a pretty good place to go. If anything, I suspect that under the right circumstances, if you did just, like, turn this all the way up to 80s grindhouse levels and just, like, okay, you are a black guy, these are terrible white supremacists, kill them all, is actually a pretty good premise for a game that is unapologetically cheesy and interested in its own power fantasy. If anything, I suspect we need more of these kind of games. Games that present, like, black people and other people of color, other people from marginalized groups, as being heroically violent against people who are irrationally oppressing or marginalizing them. That seems to me kind of a no-brainer. Like, yes, you would have to be careful about how you implement it in the same way that you have to be careful about how you represent Nazis in, you know, like a World War II shooter. But if we're okay with Nazis as shorthand for bad people justifies shooting them by the thousands in a Wolfenstein game, why the heck wouldn't we say slaver as shorthand for terrible people, therefore justification for shooting them by the thousands in an Assassin's Creed game or otherwise isn't comparable? By all means, let's do that. And with that in mind, this game kind of just leans into that. There is some complexity to it, especially towards the end when Adewale realizes that there are in fact consequences for his actions. Like, this entire ship full of slaves very much is sunk because it is a violent reaction by the powers that be against Adewale's liberating efforts. Like, yeah, that's sobering, but it also makes sense given the power fantasy. It is a proper reaction to it. It checks the player in their place. I felt guilty. Because, yeah, on the one hand, I wanted to murder the crap out of these slaving jerks. On the other hand, I felt bad and did feel a little bit convicted when, in fact, the response was, and we're going to kill a whole bunch of these black people because we no longer, you know, trust the system to work. One of the best mechanics that implements this is when you are, in fact, coming onto a new plantation. If you are discovered in the process of liberating the slaves, if you are in fact, like, found out as you are murdering your way through the various plantation owners and, like, white people who are running the show, they start killing the slaves in order to prevent an uprising. People who cannot fight back, who are not armed, and especially the slaves who are, like, the warriors and who are the best allies for you if you get the chance to actually liberate them. The emphasis here seems to be that you do in fact have to be careful, you do in fact have to be quiet, you can't be noticed in this process. Which I think is, again, a really well implemented mechanic here. As a result, the plantations are this really tense, stealthy activity rather than you just go in and just beat a bunch of heads together until everybody's dead. And what's more, it emphasizes that this is something that it has to be performed delicately. That, in fact, the people who you are rescuing, the tokens that make your numbers go up, as Chris Franklin rightly points out, are at the same time vulnerable and fragile. They can be easily lost. The effort of the game to sort of represent these slaves as people is definitely underwhelming, and we definitely should, take pause at this. But at the same time, their vulnerability and their fragility is emphasized. The fact that these are the victims of this system and not just a source of currency or some kind of resource that gets passed between Adewale and the slavers, but rather there is a fundamentally different relationship between the slavers and these slavers are in fact threatened by the slaves at the same time as these slaves are powerless to resist the violence of their oppressors. That is a more complicated mechanic, and I am kind of interested in the way that it's presented here. The fact is, Adewale, as savior and liberator of Saint-Domingue, does as much harm as good here. And as much as it is really tempting to just charge in and start killing people left and right and let all of the slaves go, there are consequences if you are not doing it carefully. And as much fun as it is to charge into a group of slavers and just start leveling righteous judgment on them, yeah, the game will slap your wrists at the end of the day for it, even if it is a little half-hearted and scripted, given the fact that the mechanics should be more complicated. Once again, we have a good proof of concept game here, is what I kind of think. This is what you're supposed to do with a standalone expansion. Explore new avenues for the franchise to develop, take it in places that were unexpected. I had a lot of high praise for Freedom Cry, in short, where Liberation was really freaking hard to get through, despite the fact that it had some really, really interesting ideas. Freedom Cry doesn't have as many interesting ideas, but the ones that they have are well implemented, well executed upon, and made for a fun 5 hours. Probably the best 5 hours I had trying to play through all three of these games. And it's probably worth noting that where it took me like a month and a half to get through Rogue and like another month and a half to get through Liberation, it took me literally a week and a half to get through Freedom Cry. It was just that much more fun, that much more addictive, that much more engaging. Now, as for the actual, story and theming, yes, Adewale is here, he's kicking butt, that's kind of his whole thing. It's very much an expansion on his character from Assassin's Creed 4, where once again, Edward has his own selfish agenda at stake, but Adewale gradually becomes more and more interested in freeing the slaves and using his connections with the assassins to get that done. Here, Adewale is very much on his own because he's kind of been stranded. It's sort of the whole setup of the plot. But at the same time, he finds contacts and he is trying to sort of liberate the slaves while reckoning with the fact that his actions do have consequences. The higher powers that be would rather see these slaves die than have them liberated and potentially upset the economic system that they support. It is complicated, it is interesting, and once again, that whole Assassins Templar division seems to be pretty clear-cut and oversimplified, but works given the discussion of slavery that we are having here. The Templars are slavers, the Assassins are liberators, isn't terribly complicated, but also doesn't need to be terribly complicated. This is one of those places where the theming is really straightforward because there was a clear moral righteousness and a clear moral wrongness, which is something that AC3, AC Liberation, and AC Rogue are all pretty willing to overturn and question, but here in Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, you really can't question it. The Assassins have always represented freedom. They have always represented freedom of ideas, freedom of people, and here we have a very clear-cut moral distinction between the jerks who are doing the oppressing and the victims who are being oppressed. There isn't even an effort to try and question, okay, is, the person who is the central, figure for the resistance, the uprising, actually a good person? Ubisoft is smart enough not to ask that question. The question that is then asked is, what is the utilitarian outcome of Adewale and the liberation movement? Namely, can we justify the fact that there is going to be reciprocations from above, that the Spanish or French government is going to demand that these people be hunted down and systematically killed, the fact that people on the boat over will be dumped like bad cargo. Can we justify that, given the fact that the ultimate goal here is to liberate the entire colony, liberate the entire island? How many people, in short, are they willing to lose for the sake of their movement? That's a much more complicated question. That's the right moral question to be asking, and that's the one that ultimately Freedom Cry ends up asking, which is pretty solid. Like, they don't explore it well enough. It's not terribly deep here, but at the very least, they raise it. They ask the question. Adewale does have to wrestle with this and ultimately decides it's not worth the expense. He decides this mission has to end. He will support the resistance however he can, but he has to stop drawing attention to it, or there will be more lives lost in the balance, and that's not a price he's willing to pay. Which is an interesting story in its own right. It's developed well. So, Freedom Cry definitely was everything that I was hoping it would be. Maybe a little less involved and nuanced than I was hoping. But all the same, it was a good time and definitely the high point of my Assassin's Creed 2012 to 2014 experience here. But that brings us to Assassin's Creed Rogue. And Rogue is... I don't know. Rogue is polished, which, you know, is more than I can say for Liberation for sure. Rogue is also, like, epic in its scale, where Freedom Cry took me about 5 hours to get through and Liberation took me about 8.5. Rogue took me about 31 hours. And again, I wasn't doing this for completion. I think I ended with a record low of 79% completion with AC Rogue. But Rogue does have a lot going on. The original setup is that you are playing as Shay Cormac, who is apparently a pre-existing assassin, and you meet all of his fellows in the Assassin's League, including our guy Achilles from Assassin's Creed 3, the guy who turned out to be Connor's mentor. You work with a lot of these folks, and then there's this big turning point, namely you get involved in an earthquake in Lisbon, the big earthquake in Lisbon, the one that Voltaire writes about in Candide, this like huge, groundbreaking 18th century tragedy that sort of changed the way the entire European continent saw, you know, human nature and like the mastery of science over the elements. You are in some way directly responsible for it. The thing that you were sent to get is responsible for triggering the earthquake. You go back to explain this to Achilles, and everyone is like, nope, you gotta go get another one. He's like, oh no, I will absolutely not do this, and then turns against his assassin brothers and becomes the titular rogue. You join up with the Templars give you missions to do, you start systematically killing off the assassins who were once your allies, in order to apparently prove that they are doing the wrong thing, and then the entire game ends very non-committally with, like, the assassins are like, nope, we figured it out, we were wrong, we totally shouldn't have been doing that, oops, our bad, and you kill them anyway. Let's talk mechanics before we get to the story and the various resonances we're dealing with here. Mechanically, this is an absolute hodgepodge of a game. You will be running around on roughly 3 different maps. There is the North Atlantic, where you will be sailing, much like in Assassin's Creed 4. You have a lot of sailing missions, and you have a lot of time spent going around with Shay Cormac's ship. You will also head up the riverways, apparently, which I originally thought was the Hudson, because, like, the Albany is on it, and other, you know, major landmarks in the Hudson River Valley. But apparently it's also the St. Lawrence, because there are definitely a whole lot of, like, deep, you know, Quebecois or Canadian landmarks that you end up visiting at various points if you explore far enough north. It's kind of a mess. I'm not going to try and, like, trace the actual historical accuracy here. Clearly the geography is, like, a combination of various northeastern sites and river locations. You'll also spend a lot of time in New York, which has been completely overhauled. This is New York before the fire, so it stands to reason that you're not dealing with the sort of burnt-out buildings that you saw in Assassin's Creed 3, but it is also a New York that has been radically scaled up from the New York of Assassin's Creed 3. Like, when you run around in Boston and New York in Assassin's Creed 3, they are very clearly small towns. Like, these are small colonies that have gotten gradually larger and larger as time has gone on, but they are clearly rough cut. There are pigs and chickens walking around. There are, small storefronts all over the place. The streets are fairly narrow and a little bit claustrophobic. But significantly, Boston and New York are very distinct entities in Assassin's Creed 3. And they are both historically accurate in their distinction. Namely, Boston is a giant mess of a place that clearly grew up, around cow paths and, back alleys, where New York is on the strict Dutch grid system that New Amsterdam was originally on. Both are small, both are run down, both are ugly and messy because, again, it's the 18th century. There's not a whole lot of resources here. They are not the sort of storied metropolises on the order of, Venice or even Damascus in Assassin's Creed 1. So you would expect them to be considerably more run down. Here in Assassin's Creed Rogue, we apparently want our cake and also want to eat it. So New York is very much the big, bustling metropolis on the order of past Assassin's Creed games. In fact, it is by far the largest and most urban and sort of developed metropolis that we've seen in an Assassin's Creed game since almost certainly Constantinople and Assassin's Creed Revelations. New Orleans is fairly close in Assassin's Creed Liberation because, it was very much sort of like its own independent, this is a metropolis, this is a throwback to the old Assassin's Creed style. But here it's even more developed, and yet it makes even less sense. Because as much as this is a huge urban environment, it is not New York. As someone who has spent a lot of time futzing around in New York, the grid system is completely gone, the logic of the city is completely gone, and yet it is also scaled up, so now the storefronts are considerably larger than they were in Assassin's Creed 3, which is itself clearly not the way that New York was in the 18th century. Sorry folks, yes, maybe in the 19th century this would have made sense, but considering that this is supposed to be New York pre-Assassin's Creed 3, it is all that much more jarring. Of the three locations, I really enjoyed navigating the North Atlantic. I thought that the mechanics that they implemented with the icebergs and, just the atmosphere of storminess and snowiness was a really cool take on the Assassin's Creed 4 model of big open world where you sail around, find lots of interesting locations, and hang out there. The North Atlantic had lots of memorable locations. There were lots of really cool frozen shipwrecks to explore and random penguins hanging around, which on the one hand I'm do you guys know that penguins only exist in the South Pole and not in the North Atlantic? But at least one or two of them were justified where it's oh, this was clearly Captain Cook's ship and it crashed and he had penguins aboard, so okay, I guess this is acceptable. At the same time though, come on guys, do your friggin' homework. I enjoyed navigating the North Atlantic. The River Valley was considerably more frustrating because there's a lot more transition. Yes, you spend a lot of time on the boat, but it's also not big and open, so you're not actually engaging in big epic ship battles, or if you do, they're very claustrophobic and kind of uncomfortable. Instead, you're going to be getting on the ship, and then you're going to get off the ship, and then you're going to get on the ship again, and then you're going to get off the ship again, because all of these locations are actually considerably larger than the ones in the North Atlantic map. So it was frustrating to navigate, certainly more frustrating than the North Atlantic. But New York was just a mess. I hated it every time that game made me go back to New York. I was this is not right. This is not the locations I'm familiar with. There is a clear lack of interest in historical accuracy across all three of these games. If anything, Freedom Cry's effort to represent Saint-Domingue is by far the most appropriate and the most rooted. In Liberation, they don't even have a mechanic where you sort of can, check on the historical accuracy of these places. Rogue is a mess, and is, on the one hand, sort of superficially trying to represent the North Atlantic world during the French and Indian War. It is kind of neat the first time that you just stumble across some random skirmish between the British and the French, and it's well represented because that's how these battles tended to work. There were very few major battles and campaigns during the French and Indian War. Most of them were just backwoods skirmishes between troops just kind of stumbling into each other, much as the game represents them. But all the same, between the fact that the mechanics are sort of indifferently implemented, at the same time as this war is going on, there are apparently places that are completely oblivious to the fact that the war is going on, which may be a little bit historically accurate, but also definitely fails to sort of drive home the conflict that you were supposedly embroiled in here. And between that and the fact that just so much of this game is so confused about what the whole Assassins versus Templars thing is supposed to be that I had a real tough time with this one. And that's really what it comes down to here. Like, Shay is a turncoat, and that is a really interesting place to take the series, especially since so many of the Assassin's Creed games up until this point have very much lionized the Assassins and represented the Templars as sort of like superficially, stupidly, mustache-twirlingly evil. For Shay to jump sides, it kind of completes the arc of this whole couple of years worth of games, this whole 18th century time period and place as it's been explored. Because the fact of the matter is, there's something appropriate about questioning this. Assassin's Creed 3 questioned the Templar versus Assassin allegiance, especially as it was examining the complicated loyalties of both the colonists and the loyalists, and how kind of both of them are responsible for oppressing, especially the Native Americans, the freed slaves like Achilles, etc. That was an interesting place to bring that Assassin-Templar divide. It is further complicated by the giant mess that is Assassin's Creed Liberation, though, again, they very much fail to come up with a cogent thesis on the subject. And it is further questioned in Assassin's Creed 4, where Edward is kind of with the Assassins, but is very much out for himself, and how the pirates sort of, on the one hand, very much embody the Assassin's ideal of freedom above all, but at the same time, so many of them are selfish, and so many of them are out for themselves, and so many of them are willing to just murder willy-nilly that the Assassins at the end of the day have to give them a pretty wide berth, as opposed to the Templars, who hate both of these people, the Assassins because they represent ideologically a freedom they can't tolerate, but the pirates because they embody, in a sort of non-ideological way, the selfishness that they also can't tolerate. So for Rogue to sort of start the game by saying, okay, here is Shay playing from the Templars' perspective, kind of would be a fairly natural endpoint for us to go. Okay, so let's see how right the Templars can be. But the fact of the matter is, this game is really confused about how they want to present the Templars. As Shay, you are supposed to be, the player character, doing the right thing. Hey, go kill assassins, because that's the right thing to do. They want to cause earthquakes that'll destroy the world, so that would be bad, right? But so much of the plot and so much of this decision-making and so much of the theming depends on this catastrophic, poorly understood mechanic of you take certain objects and earthquakes happen, that it's really hard to see this as a deep and meaningful examination of that, again, Assassins versus Templars dynamic. The Assassins aren't wrong to try and get the precursor artifacts before the Templars do. This is what they've been doing the entire franchise. And if left to the Templars, they too would just take the objects. They undoubtedly would see this as another opportunity. The Templars don't want to cause earthquakes because they don't want to cause chaos, but at the same time, having the option of causing an earthquake would probably appeal to the Templar cause, and this is not something that Shay necessarily questions, even when the game is kind of suggesting that that's the case. Haytham Kenway is obviously very interested in finding out the locations of these places. Maybe we should be asking why. Furthermore, when the Assassins ultimately do renounce their claim to these artifacts, yep, you were right, guess we shouldn't hunt these things down, can't we all get along? The answer is, well, I guess we're too late, so oops, the plot is over. Shay comes off as being very hasty in his actions, as being sort of quick to jump the gun and cause trouble where no trouble necessarily had to happen. The sequence where we go from Shay is dispatched to Lisbon, causes massive earthquake, comes back to the Assassins, tries to plead his case, is initially rejected, and then immediately betrays them, steals the artifact, and joins up with the Templars, is kind of rough to swallow. And especially as the basis for all of the actions you will be undertaking down the road, it's real tough to get behind him. The story, as a consequence, comes off as pretty incoherent. You join up with some Templars who are, in fact, pretty charismatic. Again, as I stressed before, Haytham Kenway is one of the best characters in this franchise so far, and running around with him again is, in fact, a bit of a treat. But at the same time, it's not clear where anyone is sitting here. Like, Shay is the only person who seems to appreciate the connection between these artifacts and the earthquakes they seem to cause right at the outset. The Templars and Assassins both sort of bungle their way into causing more harm than good. And as much as the game clearly wants you to side with Shay, it's really hard to do that when you know that you are now teaming up with the British against the French, a very oppressive government, who is in fact in this conflict that pertains to the other games as well. Like, these are the same people who enforce the enslavement of peoples, who force, the gradual disintegration and destruction of Native American colonies, who are systematically wiping these people out. And the game's like, no, it's cool, they're not doing that right now. Check your watch. Like, give it 10 minutes. Maybe they'll probably start doing that in the next game. It's rough. Like, it's rough to justify your actions. It's rough to sort of, team up with these people. It's rough to see them as the positive, charismatic characters that they're sort of presented to be. It's rough to justify, yes, I am now going to systematically exterminate every one of the assassins who I used to call friends, even though they did, in fact, give you positive reinforcement early on in the game. Like, it's a very rough sell. And the question I found myself asking throughout this game was, why? Why does this exist? Why is this conflict presented? Is this really just as stupidly gimmicky as it sounds? Was this game really just phoned in at the very last moment in order to provide a game that would make money on platforms that, were already well established and lots of people already owned? This was very much a pointless game, in my opinion. Like, as much as it has some good things to present to the player, as far as interesting challenges and cool mechanics and a really interesting landscape to sort of interact with, it's very clear that this was a game 1 year in development, rushed out the door just so they could say, hey, there is a game here for people who don't own the fancy new platform, as an alternative to those of you who are buying Unity for the fancy new hotness. And it just is so weak as a consequence. Like, if Assassin's Creed Brotherhood was kind of the game that I was holding up as the most pointless game of the earlier sort of generation between Assassin's Creed 1 and Assassin's Creed 3, this is very much the Assassin's Creed Brotherhood of this new generation between Assassin's Creed 3 and 5. Rogue is by far the most pointless, bland, and empty entry thus far. Even more than Brotherhood. Even though it is more cogent and well executed than Liberation and has less on the table to offer, it was the game that bored me in the Assassin's Creed franchise. 6 months of playing Assassin's Creed games did not bore me, and then a month into Rogue, and I was bored. I didn't know why I was doing this. I was confused about what the point of this project was supposed to be anymore, and very much considered just giving it up. The fact that we have any footage of Rogue whatsoever, and that I am in fact presenting this video at long last, is largely due to my stubbornness, my perseverance, and not at all the quality that Rogue has to offer here. Essentially, when I think about my time with Rogue, I think about the 31 hours that I am never going to get back. And again, there were cool things about it. It was fun to play at times. But overwhelmingly, the entire thing was just so pointless. Doesn't move the franchise forward an inch, is full of sort of back-of-the-box gimmick ideas that are kind of poorly implemented, or really, at the end of the day, are no more well thought out than a back-of-the-box blurb. In some sense, I kept thinking of this in the same terms as Far Cry 3, the game that came out a year or two beforehand, because in the same way as Far Cry 3 is full of stuff to do and full of fun things, supposedly, but is ultimately a thematic and nightmarish mess when it comes to understanding and interpreting the story, Assassin's Creed Rogue falls in the same category. And just as Far Cry 3 kind of questions and challenges, hey, are you sure you should be killing all those people? Looks like you were the monster all along, psych! Assassin's Creed Rogue seems to be doing something very similar. Oh, look, you sided with the Templars. You continued playing the game even though we told you not to. That's because you're a bad person. And overwhelmingly, I just sat there thinking, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you asking me to do this? Why do you want me to team up with the Templars? Why is the end scene of this game you, numbskull, the person who has been, quietly supporting the Templar forces throughout this entire game at Abstergo Enterprises, now you are one of the Templars or you'll die doing it, and look at you, you're a terrible person, but I'm not because I'm just making this game because I want to make a video. It was rough. And I don't think I will likely ever come back to Assassin's Creed Rogue. Again, much as I did in fact like the North Atlantic and wandering around icebergs and seeing snowy, tempestuous waters, and there was a lot of cool stuff to be said about that implementation. It is a small, small advantage in a sea of bland tripe. And I just don't see the point. It is by far the most superfluous game of the franchise so far. Because that's what it was designed to be. It was just another Assassin's Creed game for the people who didn't own the fancy new consoles that apparently we were supposed to be working so hard at. And the real irony here is that the game that they were supposedly putting the work into, Assassin's Creed Unity, as much as it was in development for 3 or 4 years before it was actually published, development of Assassin's Creed Unity had started in 2011 before Assassin's Creed 3 had even come out. For all of the effort that was put into it, either because the technology wasn't there, or the new engine was implemented way too late, or because too many games had come out in 2014, it turned out to be a mess. And between the two, between these, lackluster expansions and sequels, between these, sort of hanger-on games to the main event, between the, effort that was devoted to all of the other games in Ubisoft's catalog at this point, and between the fact that we divided our effort between a lackluster sequel on an engine that was rock solid and a brand new hotness sequel on an engine that had barely been tested and was rushed out the door with bugs to all over the place, the ultimate delivery on this Assassin's Creed franchise was pretty poor. This is the year that ended Assassin's Creed in a very real sense. And as much as Syndicate was already in the works and couldn't be turned around, you'll note that Syndicate was the last traditional Assassin's Creed game of this era. That immediately after Syndicate, Ubisoft rebooted the entire franchise with Origins and went in a radically new direction with it. And on some level, I don't think it was Assassin's Creed's fault. It was Ubisoft's fault. It was a greedy corporate culture's fault. It was a disinterest in the artistic integrity of the thing. A game that had so much potential back in 2007 when it was pitched as proof of concept, that very much was bringing in the money for years between 2009 and 2013, had gradually been farmed out to a wide variety of different developers, all with conflicting agendas and priorities, all of whom were barely communicating with each other, it seems, and corporate kept rushing these things out the door faster than they were finished. At the end of the day, it's not Assassin's Creed that wasn't bringing in the players and the money. We were still as interested as ever in the franchise and the property. The gimmick of let's play around in some old historical era, let's see, this conflict between freedom and order play out across time. That's a really cool idea that had so much more potential. But because all of these trashy sequels were released and were not terribly successful because they were trashy, Ubisoft thought the problem was the idea, not the execution. When it was very clearly the idea that was holding this thing together, and the execution that was tearing it apart. It was bad corporate decisions, bad corporate culture that made Assassin's Creed the laughingstock of the AAA game space, not the idea underlying it. So next time, that's what we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss The Fall. We're going to look deep dive at Assassin's Creed Unity, the good, the bad, and very much the ugly. We're going to talk about the corporate decisions that brought us to this point, as well as the legacy that this game has had, because Unity is a surprising animal. when you examine it from all of those directions. And I am, in fact, looking forward to replaying this one, and I hope that it is way more fun and way more engaging than this video and this level of research has been. Because as much as I have enjoyed digging deep into the dark corners of Ubisoft's corporate history, playing the actual games that were produced during this era have been rough. Many of them are half-baked or broken or boring entries, and the less said about them, the better. Unity at least promised to be something new, something big, something groundbreaking, even if at the end of the day all it's remembered for is how broken it actually was at ship. So next time, Assassin's Creed Unity, we'll talk about the French Revolution at long last. I look forward to talking about it with you soon.